How can we solve the gender wage gap? The gender wage gap is an issue we often hear about in politics and the media. But what is it actually about? Do women really earn less than men? And if yes, why is that the case? The following video wants to explore some of the main reasons for the gender wage gap and highlight solutions to tackle them. When we are talking about the gender wage gap, we often actually mean the so-called conditional wage gap. But what exactly does that mean? The conditional wage gap is when a man and a woman in the exact same situation with the same circumstances receive different salaries. This gap is hard to uncover because most work contracts are private. The more significant problem we want to talk about here is the unconditional wage gap, which is when we consider that women often tend to work in different fields, work part-time, or leave work temporarily. Let's take a closer look at some potential reasons. To explore the problem, we need to go back to where many of its roots come from. From birth on, children are influenced by their environment. The way their family and their environment raises them has a big influence on their behavior, their interests, and their ambitions in the workplace. The way young girls and boys are treated plays a big role in their development. For solving the gender wage gap, this stage of development is very important, but we want to look at where we can systematically improve the conditions. So we skip forward to the time children spend in the education system. Education is not just a process that equips kids with the skills and knowledge for life, it also plays a crucial role in their social development. Research found that the educational system partly contributes to the gender wage gap because of the experiences girls and boys have in school. This is not a claim that teachers are part of the system that is trying to push children in gender-specific roles and jobs, but they are findings that in the way that is taught in schools, the way that we test students, and even the way teachers interact with them, lies often in unconscious bias. So how can we tackle these problems? Firstly, it's important to bring awareness to the issue. If society, and especially people involved in education, don't agree that this bias in the system exists, and believe the outcome, meaning our graduates, come through a fair system, then there won't be much change. Secondly, change needs to start at the root of the education system, where teachers get taught to teach. They should have a heightened sensitivity towards gender issues and find appropriate ways to address and counteract them. Also, the way teachers interact with students, encourage, evaluate, or lecture them should not be different for a male or female student. And thirdly, we should look through the education materials and if they have a gender bias. Why only talk about all the male physicists and not spend more time on, for example, Lise Meitner, who laid out the first theoretical explanation for nuclear fusion and gave the groundwork for Otto Hahn, who then discovered it in an experiment and received the Nobel Prize for chemistry. And beyond the materials, even the tests and exams easily contain a bias, which can influence the way girls and boys react to it and perform. For example, in Austria, the entrance examination for medical exams showed a significant gender bias. Even when women represented 59% of applicants, they only represented 50% of admitted students. Increased awareness, better education of teachers around gender attitudes, and unbiased education materials and exams aren't the only measures to solve our problem, but they will set a stable foundation. After going through the education system, the challenges for women continue. Although the amount of women receiving a higher level of education has been rising steadily over the past few decades, women are still less likely to work in higher and therefore better paid jobs than men. In Europe, it is a fact that the higher a position is ranking, the more likely it is that a man is working in that position. According to recent studies, the average of female managers is still less than 1/5. The two effects we observe here are the infamous glass ceiling, stopping women from progressing in their career, and the leaking pipeline effect, meaning that women don't fill enough middle management positions to form a stable pipeline for the top of the ladder. But what can we do about it? Probably one of the most controversial solutions to tackle the absence of women in higher positions is the concept of gender quotas. Under the concept of quotas, companies have to employ a minimum percentage of women in specific positions, which is decided by the government. Critiques argue that quotas are only treating the symptoms instead of tackling the core problem of gender differences. Nevertheless, quotas can be a quick cure to the problem of underrepresentation of women in higher positions, but they're not necessarily the best and definitely not the only way. Even if a woman is finally working where she wants to work after going through education in the hiring process, there are still problems for her to face regarding the gender wage gap. One of the main explanations for the magnitude of the unconditional gender wage gap comes from American economist Solomon Polacek, who used the human capital model to describe the wage difference. He argued that women earned less because they didn't invest as much as men in the human capital, meaning education, college degrees, etc. A main reason why they did not do so is because they expected to leave the workforce at some stage in their life. But why? Interviews conducted with 34 women who left the workforce showed that 75% of them left because of children. Childcare is still women's work, even if they are working full-time. Studies found that women with access to parental leave enjoy higher earnings because of their closer ties to their firms. Also, women are encouraged to re-enter the labor market, which means that countries with generous parental leave have a higher female labor participation. But the positive effects only prevail when both partners make use of the leave and women don't leave work for too long. Especially in higher earning jobs, the negative effects can be dominant. Childcare policies have a similar effect on the labor market participation, and therefore on higher earnings. Such measures increase women's attachment to firms and thereby increase incentives to make investments in human capital. All in all, it might sound that we have found the perfect way to solve the gender wage gap. However, it is not that easy as we can derive from data, and it was not the only reason why women left the workplace. Almost half of the interviewed women left their workplace because their work schedule was too inflexible. Claudia Golden, one of the most important researchers of the gender wage gap, explained that work schedules were the reason for the remaining wage gap. She looked at different professions and compared the wage differences between men and women. The results are quite surprising. This is one of her charts. Each dot represents a job in a specific profession, either science, tech, or business. The closer it is to the line, the smaller is the pay gap between men and women. While most of the dots representing science or tech jobs cluster around the 10% wage gap line, the business jobs are far beneath them, which means that in these jobs, the pay gap is far higher. This has to do with inflexible working schedules. In business sectors, male and female employees are expected to stay in the office from 9 to 5 or any other core working period with no flexibility around. Whereas a typical scientist is mostly self-directed. Her work is mostly based on experiments. It is not as important when she conducts them, as long as she is conducting them. So what can we learn from these findings and how can we turn them into solutions? As we can see, not for all women parental leave policies solve the problem. We need additional measures. Golden states that it also requires changes in the structure of work in order to imply temporal flexibility. There even is a great example which shows that such a change had a high impact on the remaining pay gap: pharmacists. As huge chains own most pharmacies, the number of employees increased and flexible schedules were introduced. It was important that there were employees throughout the whole day in the pharmacy, but it was irrelevant who it was. This led to more flexibility for the employees and reduced the gender pay gap for pharmacists. Indeed, the full-time female worker makes 92% of what her male colleague earns. Golden recognizes that there always will be jobs that can't offer high flexibility regarding their work schedules, but there are still plenty of jobs which flexibility can be increased. This is definitely a great opportunity to reduce the remaining gender wage gap. So starting from education, through entering the work life, and spending time in and outside the workforce, we discovered the main issues that led to the unconditional gender wage gap and explored possible solutions to minimize their effects. Recognizing the complexity of the problem, we have to accept that there are still more aspects that influence the wage gap, and the different combinations of measures will lead to different outcomes. There's not a single cause and not one single solution, but with this set of policy changes, we can contribute to a significant reduction of the gender wage gap. Regarding all this information, what are your thoughts?
Created using Powtoon.